which went above 50% of the youth population. What I study in my book is two things: is, let's say, protest mobilization and how it unfolds in a context of austerity and recession. The first, let's say, figures sort of illustrated the very recession scenario. What happened in Spain over this year in terms of mobilization is something rare, both from a comparative vantage point and from a, let's say, longitudinal stance, looking specifically at the Spanish case. Particularly, many of you probably know this, have heard of this. Now, for many people, sounds already a bit quite old. Let's say in 2011, May 2011, I guess most people in the audience are Portuguese, so you know what happened in March 2011 in Portugal, the Geração Arrasca protest and so on. Something a bit similar happened in Spain in May, a couple of months later, in May 2011, basically a civil society organization, Democracia Real Ya, together with other civil society organizations, but importantly, not with the active involvement of main trade unions and main political parties, organizing a demonstration, organized this protest event against, let's say, austerity policies being implemented and the political status quo. Particularly in the country, the social democratic government led by Zapatero implemented one of the harshest, until the time, let's say, austerity packages of measures that meant, among other things, civil servant salaries getting dramatically slashed, and a massive, let's say, cut in public investment and welfare state policies provision. As said, in May 2011, thousands met to contend against these austerity policies being implemented and the political status quo. This protest in the heart of the Spanish capital, Puerta del Sol, was met with repression. So protesters and hundreds of additional sympathizers converged in Plaza Callao and then again in Sol and camped in Madrid. And basically following the modus operandi of Tahrir Square in Egypt, let's say a horizontal campaign organized in public, open, popular assemblies emerged over the following months and gave rise to the most important major protest campaign in the country, as said, not organized by main unions and political parties since the transition to democracy in the late 70s. So my book, my dissertation, tries to understand this what we'll see was a massive wave of protest and mobilization unfolding in the country in the shadow of the Great Recession. The main focus of the book is on the longitudinal dimension. It's not so much, or the search question is not so much why this is happening, but why this is happening now and how this is happening now. For this, I try to combine and use two useful, let's say, resources within social movement literature. On the one hand, I made use of the traditional theories of cycles of collective behavior and cycles of protest on the one hand, and on the other hand, I try to bring back and revisit grievance theories. I'll get back to them later, and we'll sort of delve deeper into them and what this means and how I try to use them and reinterpret them. Importantly, what I study, or the cycle of protest, the way of mobilization I study, unfolded in a context of, let's say, material hardship and recession, as we mentioned before. This is the result of this sort of research, which is basically the book. It's already available for pre-order, although the publication date is 2021. It's already available, and if you want to have a look at the PDF, just drop me a line. I'll be happy to share it with you. As said, a massive cycle unfolded in Spain during these years, and this cycle is first and foremost, or the bulk of the protests happening in the country during this year are related to austerity, inequality, labor issues, and the political status quo. Importantly, I say that I try to establish a dialogue with the theories of the cycles of collective behavior. This sort of important and widely established body of work in social movement literature, which is being used basically by the leading scholars these days in our subfield. Think of Taro, McAdam, De La Porta, and Tilly, and so on. The bulk of, or the two core ideas of these sort of theories is that, on the one hand, protests are not randomly distributed across time and space. They come in clusters, right? We observe that. So protests are concentrated, in particular historical times and contexts. On the other hand, these clusters of protest usually have a specific shape. They consist of a cycle of protest which has three phases, or three specific times. First, there is a period of, let's say, pre-mobilization and early risers. In the case of the Spanish cycle of protest, it starts with the precursors going from 2007 until kind of 2011, when this massive shock in mid-2011 happens and leads to a cycle, to a peak in the cycle of protest that persists until, let's say, late 2013. And then eventually from late 2013, we observe a demobilization phase in the very trend of protest, and also importantly in the trend of participants in most events. So these theories, I find them very helpful to understand, let's say, the logic of the cycle of protest. But I try to contend with the one key aspect, maybe the third key aspect of these cycles, of these theories of cycles. They will contend that once protests are triggered, once a peak of protest happens, protests, or the shape, the trajectory of protest, comes determined by the concatenation of two mechanisms: radicalization and institutionalization, which spur divisions among protesters and eventually lead to the mobilization or the end of the cycle. Basically, they will contend that once these massive or protesters are on the move, the peak of protest happens, there are divisions among protesters. Some of them stick to the most extra-conventional repertoires of action, radicalizing their forms of action, and others try to embrace, or tend to embrace, more institutional, routinized forms of participation, and eventually engage in more, let's say, institutional dynamics of logics. So far, so good. The thing is that what I observe and what I argue for, this I argue in a chapter that is already published in ACTA, and a paper which is drawing on chapter 3 of the book, published in Acta Politica. What I find is that there is no such trend towards radicalization. In the Spanish case, as we should expect. So as protests unfold, there is no a clear trend towards radicalization among protesters. Not in terms of the very repertoires of action that protesters use, not in the very policing of protests, and in the combination of both. So if radicalization, or this tandem radicalization institutionalization, is not a good, let's say, tandem, or is not a good explanation of the trajectory of cycle. What is a good explanation? It's a research question I try to elaborate on in chapter 3. And why not so? Why is this not the case? Well, I think it's not the case because these sort of theories of cycles tend to assume, or are better fitted to account for, a logic of mobilization that happens in context where, let's say, competitive strategies between contenders, specifically between new actors which emerge throughout the cycle. Think of 15M assemblies in the Spanish case, Indignados and Mareas and so on, and the more, let's say, established actors within the institutional domain, specifically major trade unions, have, let's say, these competitive logics. However, in the Spanish case, I argue that they tend to follow, or as the cycle, the very cycle unfolded, there is a tendency towards convergence and towards establishing bridges and more cooperative strategies. This is also what we argue for with Tiago, contrasting the Spanish and Portuguese cases. There was this massive shock in Spain, this what I called in chapter 3 eventful protest, the 15M, which led to a dramatic and profound transformation of the very mobilization realm in this context. And especially it triggered two mechanisms which didn't allow for mobilization to have, radicalization to unfold, but however, it allowed for the peak of protest to persist for long, until late 2013, early 2014. On the one hand, there is this downward scale shift, which means that instead of protest scaling up, protest went down. So basically the Indignados, the 15M protests emerged in the squares. It led rapidly to a massive wave of contestation, which was replicated across more than 50 cities in the country, with hundreds of thousands of people getting involved in very few weeks. After this, let's say, massive campaign, protesters started to scale down. They went back to the neighborhoods, establishing grassroots, local level assemblies, specifically trying to contend with very specific hot topics. So cuts specifically undergoing in the education sector, in the health system, and also tackling the very pressing housing conditions issue in the country, and the thousands of mortgages going on in very few months. Another issue that I sort of already introduced, but another mechanism that was at play was this incentive to establish alliances with these more, let's say, grassroots actors, new actors going on in the, or emerging since 2011. They were extremely, of course, it's a generalization, but most of them, or the very 15M actors didn't aim initially at establishing bridges, at establishing collaborations with established institutional actors. Neither with the traditional, let's say, parties. Think of PP, so Conservative Partido Popular, Social Democratic, PSOE, and eventually Izquierda Unida. Not that in Spain, but late 2011, what happens after this massive shock of anti-austerity protests is a change in the government. So actually the Social Democratic PSOE is replaced by a large wing of the conservative Partido Popular. So let's say the prospects of most protesters of getting anti-austerity protest or anti-austerity policies being implemented sort of vanished, because while they saw, many of them saw or experienced some kind of betrayal on the side of the PSOE left-wing social democratic government embracing anti-austerity European dictates. They were sort of, these kind of policies were not sort of being reversed over the coming years with a conservative government in office. Something similar happened in Portugal, actually, I think, during those years. So over time, these, let's say, anti-austerity challengers started to see, especially as protests unfolding, and sort of unions started to be involved, especially in the mareas that tackled very, let's say, specific issues, especially in the health education systems I mentioned. So unions, little by little, or grassroots unions at least, started to get involved somehow. Sort of, they would, these 15M actors and traditional unions started to get closer, and eventually they realized that sort of some collaborative endeavors could get organized together, especially I mean, among frictions and keeping the distance, but still importantly in 2013 very important general strikes happened in the country, because what I contend basically is that the role of unions and this capacity of unions to keep on organizing dissent didn't vanish during the years of austerity. Something also very similar to what Guya and Ramos Pinto argue in the paper for the Portuguese case. We sort of find something very similar I find something very similar for the Spanish case, is that unions didn't lose their mobilization capacity during the years of austerity. Notwithstanding, new actors with great mobilization capacity emerged since 2011 on. Eventually, they started to forge and were able to build alliances that deliver some of the most important and most massive protest events that happened in this period in 2012-13, such as these general strikes and sectorial strikes undergoing in the country. There is, however, a degree of institutionalization in the country, very notorious since 2014, that I will come back to later, because chronologically I address it in the very final chapter of, not the very final, sorry, the very final substantive chapter of the book, which is chapter 7. So far, so good. I sort of have tried to refine these theories of the cycles of collective behavior by saying that, well, in the Spanish case, it was not so much this institutionalization, radicalization tandem, which shaped the trajectory of protest in the country. It was, instead of this radicalization, which never happened, there was this combination of alliance building between unions and new actors emerging in the cycle, and downward the scale shift after these massive events of 2011, which sort of shaped the trajectory of protest and allowed the peak to persist for so long until 2014, and then institutionalization takes over. The second, and actually probably the main contribution of the book, which gives rise to the very title, deals with this, let's say, inattention within social movement research to grievances. Grievances refer to the, let's say, demand side. In the last decades, so until the 70s, grievances, which refer, let's say, to these factors that cause strain, that cause some sort of not happy, let's say bad material conditions, especially in the when thinking in economic terms, let's say these situations of hardship, unemployment, crisis, recession, come with associated sentiments, which will be or could lead people to protest or to let's say try to redress them by engaging in political action, especially through protest. So these objective situations, such as losing income, falling into unemployment, plus the associated sentiments which disrupt these taken for granted routines, will be leading you to mobilization. So grievances were the key component of the dominant paradigms in social movement studies in the 50s and 60s, but eventually sort of they were replaced by resource mobilization and political opportunity, political process theories, because, you know, mobilization was meant to be better explained by their actually organization and the mobilization of resources and opening opportunities, and not so much by this disruption of routines. So grievances were meant, let's say, in other words, to add very, very little explanatory power. However, over the last decades, there were some, let's say, exceptions or some authors which try to elaborate on this importance of grievance theories to understand mobilization, despite, as I said, there were rather marginal and secondary within social movement research. Especially, there is an important body of work which looks at the mobilization of marginalized groups, the mobilization of largely deprived groups with very little resources, especially the work of Ben and Crowert is key. And also there is this idea of, which is very important for my dissertation, which develops Kerbo, which is that the mobilization logics of movements happening in times of austerity or in times of crisis, he says, are very different from the movements happening in times of affluence. So movements developing in the 70s and after happened in context mostly of increasing, not decreasing resources, especially think of new social movements. And this has shaped also the paradigms from which we tend to analyze movements. So we don't look so much at this non-availability of resources, but okay, let's say, you know, grievances are a constant, but are not enough to mobilize or to trigger action. Let's look at other elements going on at the, let's say, organizational level, so resources, at the political contextual level, think of opportunities, or at the more cultural identity formation frames, mobilization side, which are also key to be built in order to mobilize. Another important idea that developed once, let's say, breakdown and strain tradition and the strain approaches were not fashionable anymore, especially in the 80s, was this idea of relative deprivation, which people do not mobilize so much because of how bad they are doing. The important thing is how they feel about it. Importantly, also is this idea that grievances are not so much a constant, but it's something that can happen very fast. They can happen in the long run, but also it's important something that happens in a sort of action-reaction logic. And it's important not to look only at the, let's say, economic aspects, but also how this impacts and affects the daily lives of many. Also, it's important in this, let's say, vein or following this line to look at the constructivist, subjective experience of those grievances. So the core argument or the key contribution that this dissertation, now turned into a book, tries to develop is that it is not so much these objective material grievances what would lead to protest. It's not at the individual level how much how bad economically you are doing. It's not that a crisis comes that will lead people to protest. This is mediated. This could be mediated on the one hand by subjective socioeconomic grievances in line with relative deprivation theories. Is not so much how objectively bad you are doing, but how you feel about it, both in terms of egotropic attitudes, so about your own financial self-sufficiency, your own financial situation, but also in terms of sociotropic attitudes. So how the country as a whole is doing, how the general economic situation is going. The key argument of the book, however, is that it wouldn't be neither the objective material grievances, nor so much these subjective socioeconomic grievances will lead you to protest, but they are ultimately mediated by a very political aspect, which is captured through political discontent and political dissatisfaction, which will eventually lead people to engage in action. And this is how sort of I try to refine grievance theories, bringing in this political dissatisfaction component, mediating this effect of material, economic, and subjective socioeconomic attitudes on protest behavior. On protest behaviors at two levels. I cover the aggregate level of analysis and the individual level of analysis. Now I will address, or I will focus on what I develop, or I focus on chapter 4, which is the aggregate level of analysis. Particularly thanks to the protest event analysis database that I built, and which I showed you already the trends that I exploit in chapter 3, vis-a-vis or in light of the theories of cycles of collective behavior. Thanks to that database, or based on that database, I sort of build my dependent variable of chapter 4, which is the amount of participants in protest events across time. Normally, people who use protest event analysis will take as the dependent variable, if you want to explain the fluctuation of protest over time, it will take the very event counts, so as the dependent variable. Meaning how many events per month or per year happen within a context over a number of time units. I try to move the dependent variable, and actually is one of the key contributions of chapter 4 to this sort of literature on protest events. I try to use participants in protest events over time, because we know that by counting events, we overestimate or overweight the relevance of events where very few people attended. And instead, we sort of underweight the relevance of the very very much attended protest events. I will try not to bore you with many tables and sort of graphs. For that, you can check the book if you're interested. But this is important because it basically summarizes sort of chapter 4. As said, the dependent variable is sort of the number of participants. And I will try to sort of prove my hypothesis, which is the main argument of the book that I defended before, or that I explained before. It wouldn't be neither so much, let's say, economic objective indicators nor subjective economic indicators what will be associated with an increase in protest participants over time, but will be very much this subjective political grievances measured through political dissatisfaction, which will eventually lead to protest. This, and this is the case. This is basically what I observe in let's say, chapter 4. As you see, unemployment and inflation do not play a role in triggering, or a very significant role in triggering protest, nor the very, let's say, subjective socioeconomic grievances will be associated, strongly associated with protest, but political discontent, political dissatisfaction is. And this is net of other factors associated with unfolding opportunities, such as concessions, reforms, the presence of allies. Over time, not the very nature of the organizations, whether are, or the prevalence of new versus old organizations, or the vote intentions of the people as a whole. So in this chapter 4, what I do, or what I try to do, is first I link secondary data on grievances, both objective and subjective socioeconomic, with the dependent variable, or with participants in protest over time. I try to revisit these grievance theories and complement them by showing how this, let's say, political dimension of grievances mediates the impact of the socioeconomic aspects. And I also consider these, let's say, political opportunities associated aspects and how they unfold over time at shaping these protests. So far, so good, but this is at the aggregate level of analysis. In chapter 5, I try to explore the same argument, but zoomed into the individual level of analysis. So trying to show whether there is such mediation between, let's say, the political dimension of grievances at mediating the impact of subjective socioeconomic individual aspects on the individual protest likelihood. I said before that I like particularly this idea that we also exploit in the paper with Tiago on eventful protest, which is this capacity of protest events, not only, let's say, or protest events not being only the dependent variable, but I think it's important to consider the ability or the capacity of protest events to foster change across many dimensions, let's say, at the very organizational level, at the very individual level, and in this case also influencing the very perception of grievances, and especially shaping the political dimension of grievances. What I mean is that it's not that, or what I try to explore is to what extent is that grievances lead to protest, and this mediation of the political dimension of grievances leads of this mediation of the political dimension of grievances, mediating the socioeconomic dimension, leads to protest, or is that the very participation of protest also shapes how you perceive grievances? And this is what I explore in chapter 5. This is a complex, let's say, association or a complex model with the structural equation modeling, which basically says 4 things which are quite simple, and try to refine my arguments and try to delve deeper into this association of grievances and political and protest participation. So first, generally speaking, the objective indicators of socioeconomic grievances would not lead to protest. Look at the blue ones leading to protest. In general, so income, job status wouldn't be directly associated with protest participation. 2, I'm partially qualifying these arguments. Some specific items related to some specific groups which were specifically punished by the recession, in the Spanish context at least, would be associated with protest. Specifically, the fact that you are a public worker, so you work for the state, a civil servant, or a public employee, or the fact that you are on mortgage.
Martin?
Yep.
Just 5 minutes, let's say. Okay.
Good, good. This is the let's say, the final substantive chapter I'm gonna develop. The second, so, and the fact that you're on a mortgage. Remember that in Spain during this period there was this whole housing bubble where, you know, many people were evicted and so on, and were not able to pay the mortgages they were on. So the fact that you belong to one of these groups which were particularly punished, let's say, by the Great Recession, civil servants lost between 30 and 40% of their purchasing capacity between 2007 and 2015. The fact you belong to those groups will make you more willing to protest. Third, there is this mediation of political grievances, is the green one, leading to protest. So if not, the blue ones, objective socioeconomic grievances, will take you to protest, nor the orange ones, which are the subjective socioeconomic grievances, will lead you to protest, but those lead to eventually political grievances, which are political dissatisfaction, would eventually lead you to protest. And fourth, and importantly, there is sort of a virtuous circle. It's not only that grievances lead to protest, but the very participation of protest shapes how satisfied are you with the political status quo, which ultimately shapes also your perception about socioeconomic grievances. So it's not only that grievances lead to protest, but the very fact that you participate in protest shapes your perceptions around grievances. As said, I'm finishing. I stop more on chapter 4 and 5. Why? Because, well, those are the bulk of the book and the dissertation. They develop the key argument, and also chapter 6 is already published as a paper or an earlier version of chapter 6 is already published as a paper on mobilization, and adds very little, just by showing that, well, this effect or this mediation of political grievances is not homogeneous for all protesters. The important thing of chapter 6 is that instead of treating participation as a dummy, either you participate or protest or not, I treat it as a 3-category dependent variable. So I distinguish between people who don't participate specifically in the 15M protests at all. 1, people who participated once in the 15M protest, in the Indignados protest, and only once. And 2, people who participated at least twice, so at least in 2 protest events within the 15M campaign. And the important thing here is that while democratic, in this case, political discontent is measured through democratic dissatisfaction or satisfaction with democracy. So specifically, dissatisfaction with democracy makes people who are extremely dissatisfied with democracy to engage in protest if they do so multiple times, but not if they do that just once. In other words, while multiple time challengers, so people who participated multiple times in protesters, in defeating end protesters, are more democratically dissatisfied, those who participated just in one event are not. This is important because political grievances wouldn't lead everyone to protest in the same way, but it will affect particularly those who have a higher degree of commitment to protest, or those who participate more in protests, right? And this also, let's say, a warning, especially for those of us who tend to do more quantitative research in protest, is that many people who participated or who develop sort of more qualitative approaches warn us about that already, is that participation in protest cannot be reduced to a dichotomy. It's not that you either participate or you don't participate. It's much more than that. And in this case, we observe that many or some of the established, let's say, determinants of protest behaviors, such as democratic dissatisfaction, wouldn't lead everyone to protest the same way. As long as you distinguish very simply between participating once or twice, this effect is not constant anymore. But if you were treating it as a dummy, so participating once and participating twice as simply participating in protest, you will be lumping together two very different groups of protesters, actually. Chapter 7, I'm not gonna develop it in detail, but it addresses the issue of institutionalization. It's the qualitative or the most qualitative chapter of the, let's say, dissertation. And it brings back and tries to dialogate again with its theories of cycles and acknowledging that they were right and apt at predicting that sort of the end of protest comes with an institutionalization of the protesters. In the specific Spanish case, happened first and foremost through a specific instance of institutionalization, new party formation. And I sort of try to explore the mechanisms behind this sort of institutionalization, which I argue are not so different from the ones that happen in the ascending phase of the cycle. Sort of the three key aspects, let's say, resources, in this case, symbolic construction of leadership, appropriation of political opportunities, and third, these aspects more associated with the framing and the cultural dimension, such as deliberation of cognitive cues, also help to understand why activists stopped from engaging in disruptive extra-conventional repertoires of action and engaging eventually some of the challengers adopted more routinized repertoires of action. And this is sort of the end. I could emphasize the main arguments, but I think I have already talked a lot. So looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Martin. If you want to give some conclusive words about your last slide, just
okay.
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
Okay,
if
okay.
You want, if you think
no. So just to emphasize, let's say the two main contributions of the paper. On the one hand, I try to speak to the theories of cycles of collective behavior and try to show that instead of this institutionalization, radicalization tandem, the trajectory of Spanish protest is explained by the combination of downward scale shift and alliance building in the first instance until late 2013. And from 2014, institutionalization sort of takes over. On the one hand, to what extent this sort of this different proposal of the theories of cycles of collective behavior is rooted in the Spanish case, and whether this works for context unfolding in non-hardship or non-crisis is, let's say, an empirical question which deserves further attention. On the one hand, And also, on the other hand, this point of the mediation of the political dimension of grievances, how they mediate the socioeconomic aspects, both objective material and subjective socioeconomic attitudes, to what extent this works for their contexts, and to other movements or to other waves of mobilization not unfolding in contexts of extreme and acute deprivation, is a question that deserves, let's say, further analysis, further attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. So now I give the floor to Tiago, who will comment a little bit the book before opening the floor to the public for questions and comments. Tiago.
Okay, hello again, everyone. It's a little bit strange to be in this environment where we cannot be in the same room these days, but anyway, it's good to see everyone and to discuss these, and it's good to see so many friends and colleagues around. I'm very happy to be co-organizing these events now with Guya, and I have to thank her for inviting me to participate in this. And I'm also very happy to have Martin in our first session of this academic year. And you know, it's already, we already commented that me and Martin, we've worked together in the past, and you know, he has shaped in our discussions very much the understanding that I have of the Spanish case in my comparison with Portugal. So let's say that I might be a little bit biased here in the way that I comment the book. But anyway, giving the opportunity to, I think it's an excellent book, and I'm also writing a similar book, and I'm really happy that he left the comparison for me, as otherwise I wouldn't have a dissertation to do, and it would have a lot of overlap in our topics. Also, it's a shame that we cannot do this in Lisbon in the same room and have dinner afterwards to keep the discussion going. Anyway, what I'll do here is a bit different. It's, as I comment the book, I'll try to situate the book in the overall context of the literature and compare it with some of the other books that have been published recently in the last few years as well, and then discuss its contributions, and finally do some tricky questions to see if I can catch Martin in some of these questions. So I think we have to understand the context of the book first of all. We have a wave of contention worldwide since 2008, 2010, with the emergence of the Great Recession. And data shows us that globally protest has been on the rise, also polarization, and maybe these two are very much related. But so the protests that Martin studies emerge for two reasons, I think. One, the prolonged effects of the 2007-2008 crisis, and if we keep going today with the COVID crisis, with the climate crisis, etc. And this, I think, will be very much the trend that we'll see in the next few years, with these overlapping crises, if you want. And then not only economic crisis, but as Martin rightly points out, an ever-growing dissatisfaction with political parties and institutions. And in a way, as Wolfgang Streeck points out and highlights, there's an interrelation between these two, because him being an economic sociologist or political economist of sorts, makes this argument that governments have been fulfilling mainly the requirements of the market at the expense of their citizens, and so are not able to provide many of the services that normally come attached to the welfare state, and that has created growing resentment and polarization. But why is Spain an important case? I think Spain is an important case for many reasons. One of these reasons is it it was one of the global hotspots for social movement contestation in the last decade. That's no question about it. It gave rise to one of the longest waves of protest, as Martín shows very well, since the transition to democracy. And at an international level, its practices, repertoires, and discourse became very much the blueprint for many of the Occupy movements around the world. Another reason why I think this is a very important case study is that there is a strong tradition, and historical studies on social movements in Spain show that there's a very strong tradition of autonomous or autonomous social movements, and that have mobilized very strongly over the last decades. And so the cycle cannot be considered only, this cycle of protest that Martín shows in this book cannot only be considered a consequence of the Great Recession, but it's also a consequence of these movements having been developing over the past decade. So we can think of connections between the global justice movement that was very strong in Spain and created a lot of autonomous or autonomist groups, if you want, in the country. And then, you know, Cristina Fleischer-Fuminaya shows that very well in her book. But not only that, these social movements and these protests also changed democracy. And I think this argument that we always take from Sidney Taro in his book about Italy, that the movements brought to the table new frames and repertoires to institutions. And in many cases, we have seen many of the movements and authors talking about the second transition in Spanish democracy. I think there are the elements, but I think these two are the ones that stand out. Spain being the blueprint for Occupy movements, and being autonomous movements that transform democracy and contribute to that. If we think about this book in the context of other books and the research that has been done on Spain, I think, and when I was starting to do my PhD, there were several books and papers and research being done. But at the time, what I felt it was that it was a very impressionist approach, very close to collective behavior approaches, where spontaneity was kind of key, where movements would emerge out of nowhere. And there was not a great understanding of these movements. I don't want to name anyone in this case, but but what I think more or less is that if we think about what the last few years have started to show us, is that science needs time science needs time for reflection to develop, and only now we are starting to see the most interesting books about the Spanish and reflections about the Spanish cycle of contention. Martín being one of them, the book by Cristina Fleischer-Fuminaya, another one, Ruben Diaz published as well. I see that we have Kerman as well. Kerman did some research on 15M as well. We had David, but I think he left meanwhile. So there is a lot of, and Robert Fishman, obviously, in this comparison with Portugal and Spain. And I hope mine in the next year as well will contribute for this reflection on the topic. So I think these books more or less agree on a couple of points with regards to the Spanish case. First of all, political dissatisfaction with democracy and incapacity of institutions to answer collective claims in needs of citizens, due exactly to this discussion that we were just having, that I was just referring of Wolfgang Streeck, and how welfare retrenchment was, with austerity, was cut out. That second point is that social movements answer to the crisis while simultaneously pushing towards change, and one of the examples is Podemos and the emergence of confluencias around Spain and new political parties. A third one is that social movements contribute to democratic renewal and introduction of new claims, frames, demands into the political system that political parties have to integrate. And a third aspect is the autonomy, and this is very specific about Spain, I think, when compared with other countries, and me and Martin more or less study that in our paper, the configurations and the relations between old and new actors, or between trade unions and social movements, the autonomy of the protest movement and institutional politics. And the last feature I think that normally is remarked is the importance of the transition, and Martin didn't speak of that, but the importance of the transition in shaping the movement and the reflection of the movement. And as we can see today, with the no confidence vote being done by Vox in Congress, we have almost two camps in relation to the transition. We have those who think we should almost go back to Franco's time, and another one that should renew democracy and change Spanish institutions. So this is the overall context, and I think going to Martin's book and trying to be brief and to open the floor for discussion, I think he already explained very well what he does. What he tries to bring together is a somehow abandoned theory in social movement studies, grievance theories, with some with another one that is very used, the political process. And he tries to conjugate these two to assert the determinants of cycles of protest, both at a micro and a macro level. And I think this is the main richness of his contribution, by almost conjugating this structural approach of political conflict and the types of grievance at play. So the contributions are both theoretical and empirical, and with the degree of methodological sophistication that I haven't seen so far in the field. And the main arguments and contributions are that economic grievances are mediated by political insatisfaction or political dissatisfaction or political grievances. And he has the methods, and I think that's one of the reasons why he had to let go of the Portuguese case, because there was no similar data for that. And I think another very interesting argument is an argument on how, I was just listening to him and thinking, well, it's really interesting that he's able to show that people participating in protest, change their perceptions of political institutions. And then a second point is related with the cycles of protest. And here I'm more at ease because it's also the same approach that I use in my own work. That's no radicalization. So it doesn't follow the same pattern that Sidney Taro sees in his book, or no radicalization, or I could say, or avoiding it. And the questions of alliance building and the pluralization, I think that's one of the main that I also find out in my own study, is the pluralization, or the plural, how the protest arena is so plural that new and old actors have to collaborate in order to keep anti-austerity protests going, involving multiple actors, repertoires, frames, and demands. And the book, Martin explained it very well. He has a first part with introduction, theory, and context. Then he maps out at the macro level, how the cycle of protest unfolds, and which I agree, because I've done very much the same work. And then what he does is really interesting, is to connect the protest event analysis with survey data. And he spends 3 chapters, if I'm not wrong, and I remember correctly, linking participation in protest with grievances and the cycle of protest, and how this is able to sustain protest. And lastly, comes back to the last phase about Podemos and the institutionalization phase of a cycle of protest. So I think what the novel arguments and contributions are an introduction, first of all, of nuances to Sidney Taro's argument of cycles of protests and how cycles develop. And it's a bit more sensible to the context, because I think also Taro is very influenced by the Italian case. And when we start looking into other cases, we see some differences. And so this specialization in decentralization, or downward scale shift, it's very important. And then no radicalization and the relation between political grievances and dissatisfaction in institutions. I have some questions or criticisms, if you want, about your work, and we have discussed this a lot in our own joint work, but and I think I would have some provocations as well. But the first one is, how well do these results and research travel to other countries? For instance, Portugal could be one of them, but also Greece and so on. Because my question here is, how are your results culturally and politically sensitive to this context? Because if we see in the case of Portugal, what we have is a very different transition, as Robert Fishman argues, in which there is dissatisfaction with democracy or its institutions, and it seems to be higher than in Spain, but we don't see claims or demands about democracy, right? So is this context dependent? Can we make your own research applicable to other contexts, or is this very specific to Spain? So is Spain still an exception, as some might argue? The second one is on Podemos, and this is, I think, a discussion that more or less latent in the last few years about how Podemos became sort of a different party from what he said it was at the beginning. And because most of the research at the beginning tended to link almost automatically Podemos with the 15M. So, but my question is, could have Podemos emerge without a crisis in Izquierda Unida, United Left? Because Garzón himself makes a statement that Alberto Garzón, who is the current leader of Izquierda Unida, who is now part of the coalition of parties on the left, in which Podemos is the main party. If Garzón says at some point in time that if Izquierda Unida had done its homework and renew itself, Podemos would not have emerged, would not have the conditions to emerge. And sometimes Pablo Iglesias almost says the same thing. So, and I'm thinking also that the generational gap that we see in all studies about Spain also emerges in this discussion. The last one is about radicalization, and maybe there is also an historical explanation for this, because violence these days is not seen as a legitimate way of action as it was in the 70s and 80s by the Red Brigades and so on. And the last question that I have for you, having your research in mind, where do you think research should go in terms of regarding cycles of protest and mobilization in Spain, but also overall in our field of studies? And so I'll finish here just to say that I think this book is a valuable piece of work that we should all read, and it shapes a lot of my understanding of what happens in Spain, but also it pays attention to the detail that we should understand democracy beyond institutions and have a more bottom-up approach, and also pay attention to something that we normally forget, that it's the relation between non-institutional actors or institutional actors. What is the importance of political participation in democracy? So I'll finish here and I'll open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tiago, for your comments. Very interesting, and I think also very challenging for our guest. And maybe if you allow me, I'd like to collect some more questions and comments from the floor, and after we come back to you with more inputs. So if you someone asked some question to ask now. Please.
I think David raised.
David?
I was just clapping electronically, but I can ask a question if you prefer.
You want to ask a question? No?
As you wish.
Okay, thanks. No, it's great. I really enjoyed listening about the book, so I was glad to be invited and to hear you talk about it. It's really great. I especially liked the way that you deal with kind of grievances as a sort of layered process rather than a sort of, because I mean, I think there's been a tendency to reject grievance theory because it's seen as too much of a kind of automatic, if grievance then protest. And I like the way that you're adding layers of grievances into that explanation. So I really appreciated that. That's the dog, sorry. And I also liked this idea of like multiple attenders, that people either attend once or more than once. But I thought there's a bit of a difference as well, because it's not just that there's once or more than once. There are some people that attend protests more than once per day. And then there are others who, I would consider people who have attended a protest twice still to be pretty non-attending. So I wondered if you could break it down further, whether the relationship would change, because I think quite often there's a hardcore of people who will turn up at every protest, and then there's a group, and I don't think those people are so influenced by grievance. It's part of a kind of cultural project and group and activity that form as part of their daily life and personality and so on. So, and then there's obviously a group of people who don't attend every protest, but they might be willing to if the level of grievance is high enough. So I wondered if that would sort of affect the results and how you would think about that. I guess my main question was about like thinking about the cycles of protests and kind of building on what Tiago was saying about how does the explanation travel to different contexts. So Tiago talks about different space, but I also thought about different time. So how would the cycle, well, to what extent do we think this is likely to happen in a different time period as well? Because it would seem to me that the previous cycle also is going to have an effect on the next cycle. So, I mean, especially now in Spain, you couldn't presumably expect the same thing to happen, because the process of kind of political disaffection leading to protest, then leading to sort of this kind of alliance building and institutionalization through Podemos, presumably because that's now happened, we wouldn't expect the same thing to happen again, because people will have a different understanding of what the sort of attempt to rejuvenate democracy will lead to. So we wouldn't expect a Podemos to appear again the next time people get dissatisfied. So I wonder to what extent political grievances will develop. I'll try and stop. Sorry. Yeah.
No. It's just that we lost you for some seconds.
Okay.
But
I was just really kind of asking about how we think to what extent we would expect to see that cycle again, and if not exactly the same, then in what way could we perhaps understand? Because it seems like political disaffection will translate into a hope for something new, but the hope for something new will obviously change, because the hope for something new was in the past turned into Podemos, arguably, and now maybe it wouldn't because that's been tried. So that's kind of the thoughts that it provoked. But thanks for the talk. It was really great.
Thank you, David. So if there are more questions from the floor, no. So maybe I just like to be very quick in my questions, and I really enjoyed your presentation too, and I need to read the full book, so I will be very happy to read it and to be more also to have more elements for my comments. But maybe we can discuss again in the future. We'll have more opportunities to discuss your book with. But for now, I really enjoyed your presentation, and it's great. And I think the book is surely very interesting. A point I would like to hear from you is some more information and some more definition about what do you mean with democratic satisfaction, because it's a very, very big and large concept with different elements and components, and each of them also has different effects in political attitudes. And so my point is also, okay, if this is one of the, sorry, like what, now I don't have exactly the terms that you use, but more like individual political grievances, something that are very, very important for the mobilization, and but which is the origin of these political grievances at individual level? So what is, for example, the role of networks? So these political perceptions, like to which also satisfaction or dissatisfaction are connected, are also mediated, so are not immediate. So they don't depend immediately from the political performance. And so how this is connected on the other side to more structuralist understanding of mobilization process, political opportunity structure, theory, because also in political opportunity structure revisions, theory revisions, like Dan McAdam, for instance, he stressed a lot the role of networks and groups in mediating the perception of political structure, so that is not the real dimension of political structure that that provoke or mobilization, or vice versa, disencourage mobilization, but it's the way the group mediate the perception that is it counts. So I like to know from you, if you maybe I was very concentrated in following all your presentation, and there are so many things that maybe you'd already solved at this point in your presentation, and I couldn't really understand. But if you could spend some words about this, I would really like.
Should I get back, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so, because I think we don't have any more questions for now.
Okay, thank you very much for all the questions, quite and the kind words from all of you. Some of the points are actually quite challenging, and unfortunately I don't have a clear-cut answer for many of them. I'm gonna follow a reverse order, if that's all right. So for Guya, the key concepts, more than democratic dissatisfaction, to me, or in this book, is political grievances and or political discontent. I understand it as a specific support in the way Easton does, in the sense of as in opposition to diffuse support, it refers to something very, let's say, very specific. Unfortunately, I mean, my analyses are mostly quantitative, and I have, let's say, the only, let's say, empirical option I found to measure political grievances is to use different indicators. So at the individual, in the 3 empirical chapters Tiago mentioned that I covered this association between grievances, or I try to test these arguments, I use 3 slightly different indicators depending on the survey at stake and the data available. That's true that in chapter 6, the one that looks, and I'll get back also to David's points on the one-time, multiple-time participation, I use democratic dissatisfaction. Democratic dissatisfaction is the most troubling out of the 3 indicators for sure, because it has a component that is clearly not so specific. It's quite open, and it's a rather obscure, let's say, indicator, because people who work with, for instance, in Portugal, actually Magalhães is one of the big guys who work with big experts on trust and democratic dissatisfaction. Empirically, they don't really know what we are measuring, and it's rather obscure, and I take and accept this criticism. The only thing, or what I can tell you, is that it being my independent variable, or let's say to save me, is that no matter exactly what latent dimension we are measuring, is driving different kinds of protesters to behave differently.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of what it exactly means for everyone. And specifically in this, let's say, chapter 6, I think take this issue very seriously, in the sense of I try to develop it at a later stage. I didn't show it here, but with a latent class analysis, exactly trying to delve deeper into attitudinally how every of the three subsets I distinguish between. So non-participants, one-time participants, and multiple-time participants, how attitudinally they differ from each other and what it does mean. And actually I see that democratic dissatisfaction and political interests, let's say, cluster very differently for the three dimensions, without being able to, let's say, getting a finer grained measurement of democratic dissatisfaction, specifically in this case. If the only way I could, let's say, respond to your question is more through qualitative data that actually triangulate even in that very chapter. I use some interview data, but probably it's not representative of the survey data. I mean, sort of. So empirically, I accept that is an important point, and the very mediation of networks is certainly crucial, but in all my models, the effect of political grievances and the mediation of political grievances is net of aspects related to network availability, social capital, social trust, and so on. So I'm controlling for those factors. It's not the core of my argument, but still, my effects are net of those aspects.
Okay.
And there is a robust effect nonetheless. For David, I don't know whether the dog was disagreeing or agreeing what you were saying, but the dog, I mean, the dog barking, whether meant agreement or disagreement, not sure about it.
Just keep me on my toes.
So, no, thank you very much. Very interesting, the points. Certainly, my, let's say, distinction between one-time, multiple-time, and non-participants is far from satisfactory. But it's very rare that in a general population survey, I didn't emphasize enough, that is general population, meaning that, when you measure protests through general population surveys, the amount of protesters, the problem is that normally is very small. So the thing is that you need first to conduct a survey in a context where there was mass mobilization, to have a meaningful or large enough sample of people who actually participate, and who participated in this case with varying, let's say, intensities, degrees of commitment, to be able to distinguish. So non-participants from one-time participants, from multiple-time participants, and still being able to infer some statistically meaningful results. And in this case, I can, plus I do that with participation in a very specific campaign, which is another problem of general population surveys, is that the typical question, have you participated in a demonstration in the last 12 months? Yeah, no, but well, you don't have information on which kind of demonstration. It's clearly not the same if you participated in an anti-austerity mobilization than if you participated in a pro-racist mobilization, or even on an anti-racist mobilization, right? You don't have that information. I do, because we speak specifically about a mass mobilization, such as the 15M. This is just to emphasize, let's say, the virtue of the data, having acknowledging how limited this, let's say, how raw this measurement is. But still, I think it's meaningful in those regards, covering, being able to compare with non-participants and taking into account different degrees of participation in a specific campaign. And I think that is great and very rare with protest survey and with protest survey data. And having said that, acknowledging all the limitations, the results are anyways or call to some reflection. And some of the things that we take for granted, especially when we work with quantitative survey data, are not so much when you start to nuance and take into account, you know, trying to find more finer grained measurements. And for David and Tiago's question on how well my findings travel to other contexts, I acknowledge that they are very context dependent. The same Dantaro's analysis very rooted in the Italian case, in the student protest in the 60s. Mine is so in the Great Recession. Now we are probably facing another major recession, and I don't know how. I think this disaffection is in order, let's say, and this, let's say, dissatisfaction with the political status quo doesn't have the latent potentials yet, I think, to be organized collectively and to be triggered into action. Also, it's important. This also helps to build the argument on Tiago's point. For Izquierda Unida, it is true that there was some incapacity to renew of Izquierda Unida. Having said that, the polls were giving them in 2014 an important share of votes. I mean, they increased importantly between 2009-10 and 2014. I mean, they were growing, I would say, exponentially, because the support grew from 4% to 11%, according to polls. So it's an important increase. Having said that, of course, it was far from being, let's say, a support that will enable them to win an election. I think the important point is that the shock that the 15M meant was very important, or I think it's not, we don't have still enough analysis in terms of analyzing how important this shock was for the established left. For the established left, meaning Izquierda Unida, and historical activists, especially coming from global justice struggles. Because I think this moment, what it meant, the 15M, was a major shock also for them, because there was a huge amount of people mobilizing in the streets without they expecting that, and out of their control as well, because they were not leading the mobilization, not traditional, let's say, people coming from the Partido Comunista, PCE, Izquierda Unida, not even the established, let's say, civil society organizations, CNT, CGT, and so on, nor even purely, let's say, activist assemblies coming from the more the global justice milieus. I mean, this caught them by surprise as well. And the important thing was how they interpreted this also in the, as David said, in the short term. I think it was a lot of, wow, I can't believe it. And a lot of suspicion initially, but eventually they started to build and to sort of create synergies, especially I'm thinking 2013, 14, the Mareas and the local assemblies and so on, PA and so on. And with other cases, I think, I mean, with Tiago, I think we already explored the Portuguese case. So I think, for instance, in terms of alliance building, what we observe in Spain, especially after the 15M, it's completely different from what happened in Portugal after Geração Arrasca, and then, let's say, the inability or simply non-happening of alliances between ZGT and the main unions and these, let's say, Geração Arrasca and then Rocio activists. Probably we mostly hypothesize or argue in our paper with Tiago is that in Portugal, these new emerging actors never reach, let's say, neither an autonomy from established, let's say, organizations, nor a mobilization capacity in the mid-term compared to the Spanish activists that allowed them to become, let's say, a partner in crime of established Portuguese actors. But however, there are some, I think, important, let's say, lines of continuity. Especially I'm thinking of the work by Diani and Kousis and Canelopoulos and others. For Greece, for instance, they observe that this non-radicalization and alliance building happened there. different degrees and in various ways. But for instance, I think in that way, sorry, the alliance building happened. The non-radicalization did not happen. In the sense, there was some degree of radicalization in Greece, not like in the Spanish case, but there was a lot of alliance building, for instance, between unions and labor actors on the one hand and new emerging indignados actors. So I think, I mean, much more empirical research is needed, and especially in context where this, let's say, not massive deprivation or not massive material hardship happened, but still there was waves of mobilization, and to what extent the dissatisfaction with the political status quo is driving this, I think, is something that deserves further attention, and which even if it was, the point is that even if it was somehow latent there, also in the political process tradition, the response has been from the political process theorists, because mostly political process emerged as a reaction precisely to traditional strain and breakdown approaches, let's say. So they focused much more on the supply network side, opening political opportunities thing, but not so much, I think there is still this component of forgetting the demand side, especially in terms of this political dissatisfaction, which nicely complements and fits their very sort of approach. So the overall message, I think, is not, let's say, I don't try to take down political process theories. On the contrary, I quite like them, and I try to build and complement and establish a dialogue with them, because I do find them very useful in general.
Obrigado, sorry. I had Portuguese in my mind. But well, you understand very well. Thank you, Martin. It was a very great presentation, and also I really enjoyed also this debate that we had after your presentation, and I think that we have been all working extensively on this topic. So I think that it's really our food for our mind. And I don't know if we have more questions. We still have some few minutes before closing. So if someone else would like to intervene, is the moment. So if not, maybe we can finish here. Maybe you would like to say something more, Tiago or Martin? You're satisfied with the answers, Tiago?
Yeah, no, very satisfied. I was just listening to Martin and thinking a few more things about it, but this is an ongoing discussion, a never-ending discussion about what happens between Portugal and Spain, right? It's an almost insolvable debate. But I think we have to add when comparing with Spain, we have to add two elements here. Not only the supply and demand, I think that's a really good, because I think in Portugal there was probably demand, there was no supply. I don't know. We'd have to have surveys from back then to assess that. But I think like the paper that we wrote answers some of these questions. But there is a level of development of social movements. I think social movements were not ever, if you compare the global justice movement a decade before, was not as strong as the global justice movement. I mean, there's almost no research about the global justice movement in Portugal. And I think the global justice movement was an important precursor of what comes to happen a few years later. And the other one is how the transition is framed. Because if you look to surveys on the transition in Portugal, and I mean, maybe that's changing now, and there's a bit more of conflict around the legacy of the revolution and transition to democracy. But I mean, the transition in Portugal is still seen with very good eyes. It shapes in the way that shapes institutions and so on, and people still say it's the most important event of the last 100 years, if you want. So I think that's, and I think that still keeps a little bit of class culture around. That shame that David laughed, because he would love that remark. That still keeps a bit of class culture in Portugal and how people understand inequalities and so on. And I think you're absolutely right about the Izquierda Unida, and it's one important point, and I think that comes across in many other. I was just reading Christina's book on Democracy Reloaded. I think it's an important point of comparison, and because it's a very different work on the same topic. And she argues that one of the things that made it was very interesting, because I was reading it, I'm still reading it, but there was a point that she says that there were debates in assemblies before the 15M where you had both the more autonomist guys and the left, the traditional left. And, you know, the traditional left still talks about what later in the discussions and debates within Podemos, the Rejon and Pablo had this debate about the old symbols and creating a new type of transversal populist culture. But, you know, pretty much the same thing happens. And I think that's with old activists talking about capitalism and people not having a clue and wanting to discuss things in different terms. And I think that pretty much happens with Izquierda Unida. They were not able to adapt, and so people left to form a new party, if you want. So it's very interesting, this discussion on symbols and so on. But that was just another remark on the topic, just to complement what Martin said. Yeah.
See? Yeah. Just we can close here the session. Are you happy with the?
I don't know if Martin wants to add something.
Yeah.
Well, just two things. That one that I forgot, that I think Tiago mentioned before, the generational component is something very important here, and I think is sort of reshaping So the 15M also had let's say, an impact that I try to measure, and I try to delve deeper into the book in the short run, at the short term. But I think this mobilization capacity can translate also in the mid-long term. I'm optimistic, at least, in terms of, well, it helped politicizing and socializing in politics and protest a whole new generation. And we'll see what consequence it brings in the midterm. But importantly, these days in the country, now with the COVID, everything changed, but until the COVID at least, I think the two movements with the, let's say, highest mobilization capacity were the feminists and the environmentalists. So FFF, non una di meno, ni una menos. And importantly, these movements will probably be part of what we consider new social movements that are taking a completely new fashion that I'm actually exploring now, or starting to explore in this new project. I have been doing it in Italy at Cosmos with Donatella, and now I'll, let's say, keep on my own also with synergies with Italy, and especially comparing the Spanish and Italian cases. Because importantly, I think in those specific two movements, also in the anti-racist movement to some extent, we're observing how these traditional, let's say, movements which will correspond to the new social movement logic are bridging and building on a lot of the narratives coming from anti-austerity and anti-capitalist struggles. In the feminist, environmentalist, against climate, for climate justice, if you like, and anti-racist. So these intersecting sort of narratives around inequalities and injustices are very, very interesting and worth exploring also in light of this generational issue. And finally, just wanted to thank you all, especially the survivors who made it until the very end.
Hey, but they are my students, so that's why they
No, really,
Hi, Andrea. Hi,
you.
Flavia. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Really, it's been
we could probably switch to Portuguese now.
Podemos não. Com prazer. Então, a próxima que seja em Lisboa.
Yeah, isso seria muito bom. Yeah, we should really definitely to think about something. And you know that, so yeah, Lara is also here. She's also my student, a PhD student. And Andre is who's finishing the master. Is Andre? Can you hear us? Is leaving. Okay, but
he wrote something. Escreveu agora a dizer obrigado pela apresentação.
He is finishing his master thesis. And he did a very good protestant analysis. So I think he was enjoying also the presentation because of this on student protest. Yeah, in Portugal.
In which period?
Between in the last Andrea, remind me exactly the chronology. I think it ended in 2015. Yeah, from 2008, I think 2015.
Okay. Good. So we have a colleague at the SNS who did that for Italy and the UK. Cini.
Yeah.
Tiago.
Cini. Sí.
Yeah. Tiago.
No, I actually recommended Cini's work to Andre when I was still in Florence. So.
Okay, yeah. And also Lorenzo's work was very.
Tamponi.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Cini did specifically his dissertation on this, the Onda, l'Onda, no? In Italy.
Yeah.
And specifically on student struggles. And now they have the book with Donatella just out, no? The one on the contentious politics of higher education.
Okay, good to know.
On the, where they do a Protestant analysis, I think, as well. So comparing Italy, student protests, Italy, the UK.
Do they?
Yeah, they have some stuff. South Africa and Quebec.
Very good.
I think, I don't remember if they do, but...
At least for some cases they do, huh? For Italy, they do for sure.
Okay.
I read the book.
But they don't cover
I think
Portugal,
it was
of course.
No. No.
The book is this.
I will. I was here opening, but okay, we don't have time to open. I was file, etc. To be more careful in the period. Tell you more about the period, but maybe we. We discuss more in. It's here. Between it's 2005. Yeah, it started in 2005, not 2008. Good.
Yeah, I'm sending.
Good. And Lara, she's doing the PhD, and Flavia is already disappeared. But the closest to the end of the thesis is Andre. So he should submit in like 10 days. So, but maybe we can.
Boa sorte.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Martin. And we keep in touch. Falamos prossimamente. Vai estar mais perto.
Muito obrigado pela invitação e espero que nos atopemos pronto. Seja em Lisboa, em Madrid, em Florença, onde seja.
Com certeza.
Onde seja. Muito bem.
Ou Galiza.
Ou Galiza.
Muito bom. Obrigada.
Obrigado.
Tchau, obrigada.
Ciao.